Sorry. Yeah, Senator McDonald.
Well, Senator Collins, with all the questions that she had, seems to have disappeared from the chamber, so I'll take the call if I can. And like some of my colleagues, I quite like Senator Collins, and we get on well together in the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, but I have to say to my good friend Senator Collins, you'll need to get some substance in the debate if you're going to carry this on for a couple of hours, because, quite frankly, I've never heard so much padding in any speech for a long, long time. But look, Mr Chairman, can I just explain to those members of the Labor Party and people who might be listening, because this is a very serious debate. It's about our democracy, and it's about allowing Australians to vote for who they want to vote for in the Senate. And, Mr Deputy President, Mr Chairman, I can't understand why the Labor Party can't see that. It's a pretty simple bill. Effectively, there are a few other provisions, but effectively it says above the line you can vote 1 to 6, and the one you vote above the line, the 2, 3, 4, is for a political grouping. So if people want to vote 1 in the Liberal National Party box in Queensland, what effectively that means is that they're voting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for the Liberal National Party team, and if they voted 2 for the Christian Democrats team, it means that their votes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 would go to the Christian Democrats. So that's pretty simple. Much better than the current situation, where you just put a 1 in the political grouping of your choice, but then you just adopt the grouping that your number 1 choice has registered with the AEC. Pretty complicated system. And so people who were voting 1 for the sex party didn't actually realise that their effective preferences were going to the Christian Democrats, and vice versa. And that's because, quite frankly, 98% of Australians didn't understand when you voted 1 above the line, you actually adopted the registered card of your chosen political choosee, and you had no idea where it went. Under this system, the people of Australia will actually decide who they want as number 2. And maybe people from the Christian Democrats do want the sex party as their number 2 choice. I doubt it, but maybe they do. But now they have the option of voting 1 for the Christian Democrats, 2 for the sex party, 3 for the Marijuana League or whatever. But it's their choice. If that's the way they wanted to go, that's it. So it's a pretty simple bill. The addition that arose out of the committee hearing a couple of weeks ago, the committee looked at this all and recommended to the government that they should go 1 step further, which was back to what was proposed by the all-party committee unanimously just 2 years ago, go back to that, which meant that as well as doing above the line on a 1 to 6, you could go below the line 1 to 12 optional preferential. So that means if in Queensland people want to vote for me, number 1, but they like Senator Moore, so they don't want to give their second votes to another one of my political party, but they want to vote for Senator Moore because they think she hasn't done a bad job. So they can vote under the line. All they've got to do is fill in 12 squares. They can put me 1, Senator Moore 2, whoever they like, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Their vote will be valid, and then they choose who they want. Not the LNP in that case, or not the Australian Labor Party in Senator Moore's case. The people themselves choose it. So what's so bad about that? How outrageous is that? I mean, it is such a good idea that the respected Labor Senator John Faulkner sat on the original committee and was part of the unanimous recommendation that this new approach be adopted. Not only was Senator John Faulkner there, but as well as that, so was Senator Tillham. and Mr Gary Gray, who we know understands these things. Gary Gray was the National Secretary of the Labor Party at an election a few years ago, and so he understands implicitly the voting system. And yet Mr Gary Gray, a Labor Member of Parliament, was one of those who joined with Senator Faulkner and unanimously supported the approach to bring in this new regime that the bill before us is now. Now, Mr Chairman, you don't need to be very clever to work that out. Pretty simple bill, pretty simple on how it works. 1 to 6 above the line, 1 to 12 below the line, if you like, and the people of Australia then make their own choice. And if you get a quota, you're elected to the parliament, because that's what the people of Australia actually want. Now, I understand a bit of good detective work by some of my colleagues that the submission that the ALP put to that first inquiry, this is the organisational ALP, they actually made a submission to the original inquiry which asked for just what we're doing now. That's what they asked for. And I'm told that the president of the ALP at the time was none other than Senator McAllister, who curiously replaced Senator John Faulkner when he retired. So Senator McAllister was president of the ALP, and serendipity indeed. She was president of the ALP. She signed off, or had her team sign off, perhaps it was then Mr Dastiari, perhaps signed off, a submission to this inquiry saying, this is what you've got to do. You've got to have optional preferential above the line and optional preferential below the line. That's what we want. That's what we, the Australian Labor Party, want. So, naturally enough, when it came before the committee unanimously, and certainly the 3 or 4 Labor members on that original committee, they all thought, well, we think it's a good idea, but not only do we think it's a good idea, but the organisational ALP, in their submission, they also thought it was a good idea. They asked the committee to do it. So the committee did it, unanimously. All the 8 Labor people supporting it, and everyone else. And yet here we are a couple of years later, and it seems that no longer do the Labor Party support it. So you can't understand why. Nobody's given us a serious explanation. As I say, with respect to my good friend Senator Collins, she just waffled for 8 minutes and then couldn't even finish her 15 minutes and left away. So it is an important piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that should be passed, and what's more, it's a piece of legislation that the Australian public want us to pass. I challenge any senator in this chamber to go back to the aftermath of the last federal election. There was palpable anger around Australia, not from political parties, across the board. The people of Australia could not understand how their vote could be hijacked by a mathematical gaming of the then preference system, where a lot of the minor parties cross-preferenced, and I said you have the very odd situation of parties of the extreme left end up supporting parties of the extreme right, and vice versa. And nobody can understand how Australia could get into that situation. And yet this bill before us today is very, very simple. It makes it easy to understand. It says to the voter, you pick who you want in the Senate. Don't allow the backroom boys to do it. And I mentioned before, but I'll mention it again, because people listening to this may not understand, but Mr Bob Katter was the member for Kennedy. He used to be a member of the National Party, but he left the National Party in a huff at one stage and became an independent. But he was saying to his supporters, look, I'm preferencing the Liberal National Party, so, you know, I still have my basic philosophy, it's just that I don't like the party. But, you know, if you vote for me, your second preference will go back to the Liberal National Party anyhow, because many of the people in his electorate are people who prefer our side of politics to the Labor side. And But Mr Katter in the Senate had registered a card, as all the parties did. Very few people saw them. I had a look at them, but I'd be one of the few in Australia that did. But when you had a look at Mr Katter's card, he actually preferenced the Australian Labor Party before the Liberal National Party. And although he was denying around the state that he was supporting Labor, no, my preferences are going to the Liberals and Nationals. But you have a look at the registered card he had that most of the people who voted for his team in the Senate would not have looked at. But if you did have a look at it, you'd see effectively that, with respect to you, Mr Chairman, got the preferences of the Katter Party before the Liberal National Party. And yet, as those of us who follow politics know, that's a seat where a lot of the people who support Mr Katter, because he's an old friend and I think he's a nice guy, pretty ineffective but a nice guy, so they vote for him but expect that if they vote for him his preferences will go back to where they really belong, and that's the LNP. But you look at the card and, sorry, Mr Katter's card didn't say that. So this is the sort of thing that this legislation will stamp out. If the people want to vote for Mr Katter and give a second preference to Labor, that's fine, but they do it themselves. They don't vote one for Katter thinking that his preferences will come to the Liberal National Party. They will in the future be able to actually exercise their vote. And so many people in the Senate vote in Kennedy will now be able to say, if they want to vote for Mr Katter, one for Mr Katter's Senate team, but two for the Liberal National Party or wherever they want to go. But it will be their choice. Now, how can anyone object to this? How can you argue against it? I know Senator Faulkner couldn't argue against it. In fact, he was one of the main protagonists of the proposal. I know Mr Gary Gray can't argue against it because, again, he was one of the architects of this piece of legislation. And I just hope that perhaps Senator Moore or Senator Collins, if she comes back, may be able to explain to us the change of heart. Why was it 2 years ago you thought this was a great idea? Senator Faulkner thought it was a great idea. Mr Gary Gray thought it was a great idea. All senior respected members of the Labor Party, they all thought it was a good idea. The people of Australia thought it was a good idea. But suddenly, for a reason which has not been explained, and I will wait anxiously to hear the explanation, for reasons that have yet to be explained, suddenly the ALP have done a complete blackflip. Now, I can only think that it's Senator Conroy and Senator Carr, the big backroom dealers, have suddenly worked out there's a way they can rort, and I use that in a political sense, rort the system and give themselves a political advantage. And they're keener to do that and leave in place this broken system than allowing this legislation to go through and give the people of Australia the right to make their determination of who they want to elect to the Senate. And I can't think for the like of me how anyone can seriously argue against that. I'll be listening very intently to future Labor speakers to have the explanation, and the explanation of why it was that some of your most senior, some of your most respected members of this parliament were totally in favour of this bill 2 years ago, but suddenly Labor's not. Now, as I said before today, Mr Chairman, this has been fully debated. 23 hours now in this chamber, 23 hours in this chamber, and if you haven't been able to make your point in 23 hours, Senator Collins, I don't know what another 23 hours is going to allow you to do, because we've had this debate. We've had 2 full committee hearings. We've investigated it uphill and down dale. Everybody knows what it's about. Everybody knows that it's what's needed for real democracy in Australia and for Australians to be given the right for them to select who they want in the Senate.
Senator Collins.